Hi everyone, this is Dr. Raquel Butler from Integrated Veterinary Therapeutics.
And Sophie Vandenberg from Equine Postulate. And we welcome you to the Equine Functional Posture Podcast, your ultimate source for insights into the influence of functional posture on biomechanics, health, and overall well-being of horses.
Whether you're a seasoned equestrian, an equine professional, or simply a horse enthusiast, this podcast is designed to help you understand the critical aspects of functional posture.
Tune in each week as we discuss practical tips, delve into expert interviews, and explore the latest research in the impact of functional posture on equine anatomy, physiology, movement, and more.
Let's create a world where we empower our horses to be in a mental, emotional, and physical balance. Welcome to today's podcast. We are talking about training versus conditioning today, which is a really important topic, especially if you do compete in a specific discipline, but not even if you're competing, like also if you're just trail riding your horse or you want a weekend warrior horse as well, because having an appropriately conditioned horse is going to be really important. So how are you going today, Soph?
Hi, Raquel. Very good. This is certainly something that comes up a lot just in everyday discussion. So it's going to be very valuable for anybody who does anything. I mean, even just one thing popping into my mind right now is the fact that often, if you're an amateur rider, you don't really, you might just ride on your farm or on your place or agistment, but often your clinics are held in arenas and there's sand. And so, I've been to clinics or events and horses standing around in the sand, even just walking, they're not conditioned for it. And so often you don't, you've got a horse who might not be able to get the most out of that session, or you end up with a sore or cranky horse, all sorts of things. So there's just so many ways that you can apply the information we're about to talk about.
Yeah, and the thing is that training and conditioning often get used interchangeably, so it's not really clear on the difference. And the way that, we're defining it today is that training is more about teaching your horse how to do things and what to do. It's skills. It may have implications on behavior, and it often involves cues, so how we want them to respond, how we want them to do a specific things. It can use like habituation, like just getting used to things to train them from that perspective. But the other way we define it is that it's a conscious connection to the way that they are moving, and it's very specific to them being able to execute specific things that you're asking them. Sometimes they're biomechanically mindful about that, depending how you're training, and other times you're doing it for responsiveness or, a certain response in the cue. But for us, it's also that connection to the movement, that conscious connection to what they're learning. What about the definition of conditioning?
So conditioning is about preparing the horse's body. So their tissue, their muscles, tendons, ligaments, their cardiovascular system, their nervous system, and that's an adaptation. We're talking about a change over time. So the word is conditioning to handle the physical demands of work. And so, there's so much importance and value in both training and conditioning. With your conditioning, you're getting efficiency in motion, reduced fatigue, improved performance. You've got there's things we're going to talk about how it's appropriate for you to bring in lots of different kinds of conditioning to bring your horse up to a specific discipline in a way that you may not even think. We were just discussing the fact that in endurance, cross training, so using other styles of training, allows you to reduce the amount of long, slow distance work you have to do, and then you get to reduce the load on your horse's body, even though you retain their fitness. So that's conditioning rather than training. What other importance and value do you get from training and conditioning?
Yeah, well, I think that you can, just because your horse's discipline is a certain thing, like racing, we were just talking before about racing, just because that's what they do, it doesn't mean that you have to race, like gallop them to condition them for racing. So, like, I remember when Henry was a racehorse, to keep him, it was to help him mentally as well as physically, but like he was doing some jumping. And so, there's more dressage, more racehorses now doing some dressage. And so those activities are like your jumping's building your anaerobic pathways, which we're going to talk about, and the dressage is building, aerobic pathway. So those two things, even though they're not galloping on a track, are actually conditioning the horse to be able to handle racing. And then you can be more specific about your gallops training so that you can reduce the load on the horse's muscles, joints, bones, and actually have a improved longevity. So I think applying appropriate training tools and conditioning tools really reduce injuries and improve your horse's longevity. So that's really important. And then making sure that your horse is fit for purpose is going to improve all aspects of your horse's willingness, their safety, their confidence in their bodies, and their ability to use their bodies. So, we want a horse to be fit, but what that means is that they're fit for the task posturally, mentally, and physically, and they have a really good ability to recover. So we're going to now talk about specifically training. And we're never not training. Like it's
Yeah.
you're always in everything you do with horses, we're always kind of training them in a certain way, but training is really important, especially at the beginning, to make sure that they're kind of using their bodies appropriately and that they understand the specific aids, cues that are going to be asked of them, and it really will reduce their emotional stress. So what do you have to say about training?
So, when you are training your horse, you're thinking about their mind, their behavior, and their movement pattern. So that, as a bonus, something that you're going to get from that is it's going to improve your safety. It's going to improve your horse's confidence, reduce their stress, and also increase their mental engagement. So that's very meaningful to horses, and it improves their well-being, and which is something that you're aiming for as well, because a reduction in stress is going to improve recovery when it comes to conditioning. But we'll go into how they support each other, training and conditioning. But as far as training goes, it's going to improve your neuromotor control and your attention. So shaping the horse's mind to pay attention to things, something that you build over time, their level of focus and the time that they can pay attention to you and what you're asking of them. It's very useful for limb control and proprioception. So if you are going to teach your horse how to do small movements to step carefully between tires, training is going to be, I'm going to teach you a cue how to do this slowly, and I'm going to teach you a cue about how to move your forehand over or you move your hind end so that we have control and we can move carefully. So developing those cues, especially for your transitions and your gaits, to be able to hit those accurately and support your horse. It includes habituation and desensitization. So that's very important for going places, exposing your horse, taking them to see new things and developing their confidence in going to new environments as well. What else do you think comes into training? What else is important?
Yeah, training things like how to do lateral work correctly and making sure that the biomechanics of it are efficient, because you can do a shoulder in all day long to create a conditioning response, but the more biomechanically effective and efficient that is, then you're actually going to improve your overall conditioning response. So making sure that they understand how to do the lateral work correctly, shoulder in, travers, renvers, half pass, because I see, lots of horses, even at high levels, that are doing movements like that, but they're not actually in the most efficient biomechanics. And so they're just going to fatigue more quickly. They're not going to have the same strength. They're going to be at an increased injury risk. Or they just don't have the longevity to last out years at that level. Like they just start breaking down early. So having a good quality, responsive, biomechanically efficient lateral work, the same with transitions. So training them to have an effective response, to also be doing them in a biomechanically correct manner and not just doing them like a horse can be trained to do things in a speedy, like quick way where they're, just like they stop, they go like really efficiently and quickly. However, we also want to link that training in with biomechanics and make sure that they're doing it in a way that sets them up for appropriate strength building through your conditioning phase. It also, your training develops that language between your horse and rider, or communication between you and your horse. If you're able to kind of recognize where they're struggling with things in their training, then you can rectify that before you take it over into becoming a real conditioning type response. So yeah, I think it's really, I think what we often do is we want to do the things, but we leave out the really specifics. And like, Stephen Peters that is we've got here written down, is that he's an equine neuroscientist who talks about, the importance of training and how horses need rest in the moment to really consolidate the training, how they need time overnight to actually consolidate training and really establish appropriate like neural connections and make those neural pathways super strong. So that then when you go into the conditioning aspect, you've got this super strong postural, biomechanical, brain understanding of what you're doing, and then your conditioning is just going to be so much better at that point. So training is the foundation of all of those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really valuable. And, it's a skill in itself. It takes time to learn how your horses work cognitively, how they actually learn new things and how you should structure your sessions when you're simply just trying to teach them something new. And even though it's different from conditioning, it's just as valuable because it gives you the ability to see that you have holes in what your horse does and doesn't understand, and you can meet those needs. I know for me, a blend of equitation science and mindfulness about how the horse feels as we're doing things leads in general to a very effective way of teaching new things.
Yeah, it's the how the horse feels and the, principles of learning. And then it's also those observation skills of the biomechanics that are linking in there as well, because you can observe the horse's responses, but you can also observe the quality of the motion. And so that, all ties in there. So, thinking about that training aspect of it, but then shifting over into conditioning, which obviously over time your training becomes conditioning, because if you continue to repeat things, you're going to be conditioning the horse. But it just takes time. Conditioning doesn't happen overnight, right? Like we can go to the gym once this week and once that next week we're not really creating a conditioning response. Like maybe we've improved in other areas and there might be some sort of conditioning response. But if we want to train for a marathon, then we're looking for a different conditioning response to be able to handle a much longer distance. So we have to, when we consider conditioning, we want to think about, okay, what is the end goal? What does our horse need to be able to do? Like you said before, if you're going to be doing clinics or competitions on sand, then you need to know that your horse has appropriately conditioned muscles, tendons, ligaments to handle sand. And so, if you don't have sand, how can you mimic that? Like, you don't have to train the specifics of the discipline. There's other ways you can modify. Like, if you don't have sand, then maybe you do some gallop intervals. If you don't have sand, maybe you incorporate, jumping a couple of times a week. Like, you can increase a load to mimic,
Condition.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
condition those things. So yeah, what's some important other aspects about conditioning apart from, discipline?
So I would say that that's a little bit of a specific within the category of conditioning is understanding aerobic versus anaerobic conditioning. So when it comes to aerobic conditioning, that's the foundation of all sports. And overall, it's just your improved ability to utilize fats as fuel. It's a very effective oxidative pathway in the body. It also uses glycogen as a fuel. And so it gives you a fantastic foundation for having, it's often a term we use as fitness, the ability to have oxidative pathways that are effective inside the body. So you can go out and go for a longer run and your body tips over into your um, aerobic energy pathways. When it comes to anaerobic conditioning,
Sorry, can I just add in with the aerobic?
Mhm.
The aerobic conditioning is your ability to utilize oxygen as well, so that you're utilizing the fats and the glycogen, but it's your ability to maximize your oxygen usage to create energy. And so what you want with aerobic conditioning is that you can utilize oxygen for longer. So if you're in a sport that is high intensity, which not all sports are, like if your horse is going on a trail ride, it's going to be mostly aerobic conditioning, like unless you have a sudden gallop up a hill or something. But if you're just going on an easy trail ride, that's going to be aerobic. So you're just able to utilize, you have enough time to utilize oxygen all the time. So that's our foundation, because if you improve that, it means that holds out for longer before you have to use anaerobic conditioning. So if you then explain the anaerobic conditioning.
So your anaerobic conditioning is about, when you're using speed, bursts of strength. It's when you aren't, it's oxygen limited. So you're not your body has a tip over phase. So it goes from your anaerobic energy usage state into your aerobic energy
Other way
usage.
around.
Can you say that for me? I feel like I just have said those words 10
So
times.
goes from your aerobic into your anaerobic, but they're always kind of working this at the same time. So you'll always have an underlying aerobic aspect to it, but it tips over into less oxygen is available because the body has that sudden burst of speed or strength. And so because less oxygen is available, it utilizes other pathways for metabolism and energy production that don't last very long. So that's why we want our aerobic system to be super conditioned, but it gives them that burst. And so, with a thoroughbred racing, we want them that anaerobic aspect to be kicking in the last part of the race, not the entire race, because then they don't have enough to sustain that. Like they need the oxygen usage. So that's kind of it's the oxygen availability that will dictate that, and then the speed at which energy is required.
And the focus being that we improve our physical fitness, strength, flexibility, endurance, and also your postural balance as well. So the overall goal being your horse is physically capable of performing the task that you're asking of them without fatigue, risk of injury, pain. So that really sets you up for being able to go out and do go out for your endurance race or go out for your jumping round, and your horse isn't at risk of, having a negative detriment because of what we're asking of them.
Yeah, and they have a really good recovery as well. So, a fit horse that's really well trained and conditioned will pull up better than a horse that hasn't been conditioned to the task. So through optimizing that, you're setting a horse up for a really good recovery and to perhaps pull up for competition next weekend. So the quicker they recover, then, the more efficient their whole system is going to be in what it needs to do.
Absolutely.
So there's a few interesting facts. So what are some of those in terms of horse fitness and conditioning?
So I think it's, incredibly cool that a horse's upper heart rate often gets, up to 240 beats per minute. A galloping horse can get their heart rate so high. That's a really high heart rate, when they're thundering along. And another fun fact about the heart is that stroke volume. So this is the volume of blood that gets squished out of the heart every time it goes ba-boom, is about 1 liter. And with fitness, you have what's called a conditioning response. That happens all throughout the body, but in the heart, the effect is your stroke volume, so the amount that's squished out of the heart per beat, can increase up to 1 liter, 1.3 liters or 1.4 liters. So, that's a much more efficient, it's a larger volume being pushed out with every beat. And so when a horse is at rest, on average, often their cardiac output, so over the course of 1 minute, the amount of blood that's leaving the heart and being pushed out into the body is about 40 liters. So that's per minute. And then because they have such an increase in their heart rate, you can get up to 250 to 350 liters, depending on how fit the horse is, leaving the horse's heart and being pumped out into the body per minute. The sheer volume of that is, it's huge. Up to 350 liters. That's a lot of liquid to be pumping through and pushing around the body.
Horses really have an amazing athletic capability to be able to do that. That's why they're such amazing athletes, and they can be successful at so much, different variations in disciplines and things. So yeah, they're quite amazing in their athletic ability. The other interesting fact is that with us, our resting heart rate decreases with fitness, but with horses it doesn't. So generally what their resting heart rate is what it is. So, the Arabs have quite low like a good Arab that competes in endurance has quite a low resting heart rate. And I remember when I learnt this, because I literally thought that most horses had a resting heart rate of around 30 to 40. And then I met my first Arabs and they're like, no, his resting heart rate's like 20. And I'm like, what? Are you sure? That's so low. And so, yeah, they can have this amazing capacity to go from like a resting heart rate of 20 up to a maximal heart rate of like 260. That's just huge. And so, but that resting heart rate doesn't change no matter how fit the horse is. It's generally inherent to that horse. But what does change with the horse is how quickly, so with fitness, how quickly they can recover. So that's why at events, heart rates are measured at certain intervals when the horse, so like a cross country, they come in, they're measured at a certain time after the horse has come off the cross country to make sure that they're recovering. And if they're not recovering back to a certain heart rate in a certain time, they're not fit enough, or there's some other kind of health problem that's affecting recovery. So the endurance people are really good at measuring these responses because they need to get their horse through 80 kilometers, 160 kilometers, marathons, and they need to know that their horse is 100% fit enough And they also don't want to overtrain them, because an overtrained horse in any discipline really has an increased chance of injury, and an increased, they're going to fatigue much earlier, even though they're highly trained. If they're overtrained, it actually starts having a negative effect on their system. It creates a stress in the system. And also, they might not be able to handle the conditions if they're not trained appropriately. Like if it's a hot day, they have a lot of sweat losses, and you see horses at endurance events that have been vetted out on metabolic issues, gut problems, metabolic alkalosis, those sorts of things, where their whole system is just struggling with the amount of change that's happened over that period of time. So, that's what they can't get away with it as easily as other sports of not having their horses appropriately conditioned. And in that sport, they have a prize for best conditioned. And if only we had that in all sports, because that prize is better than winning. For when people get that prize of best conditioned horse, which means that their horse came in with the best recovery heart rate, best gut sounds, best stride qualities, best muscle qualities. That's something to be extremely proud of, because it means that you've conditioned and managed your horse really well. So I wish that we had that across more disciplines, because we'd kind of uphold higher standards, I think.
So if we talk about what changes are happening, what are some comments you have about changes with muscle fibers?
Yeah, so horses are born with specific muscle fiber types. So, for example, Arabs have more of the type 1 muscle fiber, which is a slow twitch muscle fiber that requires oxygen to work, as opposed to a quarter horse that is generally born with a higher proportion of type 2 muscle fibers. And type 2 muscle fibers are split into type 2 A and B, or type 2 A and X. It's always a different terminologies. And so quarter horses have a higher amount of the type 2s, Arabs have a higher amount of type 1s. Arabs long distance, quarter horses quick, sharp bursts of energy. But we are able to train those muscle fiber types. So with conditioning, then we can, increase the number of type 1 muscle fibers, decrease the amount of type 2s, depending. And obviously, the younger the horse, the more quickly, the more able you are to change that. And that's why we talk a lot about long, slow distance in young horses, so that we set them up with a good percentage of type 1 muscle fibers, because that's going to reduce the stress on the overall system. And then, the way that muscle fibers are recruited is going to change. So obviously, a horse that's more conditioned is going to utilize its type 1 fibers for longer than the type 2 fibers, because it's going to be able to handle what's being asked of them without getting tired and needing to kind of rely on pure strength. It can utilize that oxygen for longer. So that's kind of the influences, with the muscles. Also with the muscles utilize ATP in energy production. And so with conditioning, our ATP production and the efficiency of utilization is improved. And they build up more ATP stores in their body. And so, they're able to utilize that a lot more efficiently. And to do that, that means they have an increase in enzymes, they have an increase in oxygen utilization capacity. So like the mitochondria, which are the energy powerhouses of the cell, they actually increase, and that means that you can produce more ATP. And then to help all of that, you get an increased capillarization, which means you actually get more blood vessels in the muscles. And so that means you can carry more blood to the area. It means that you can carry more oxygen to the muscles. It means that you can get rid of waste products much more effectively. It means you can move fuels, so like you can mobilize glycogen and fats more efficiently to provide fuel for ATP use. And in moving those waste products, which a lot of people think that lactate is the big problem guy, for like if overworked, you get sore, it's because of the lactate. Well, actually, it's not. Lactate is a byproduct of energy production in the muscles, but it's also a substrate, so it can actually be used for energy production. But what builds up when we get a buildup of lactate is we get a buildup of hydrogen ions. And the hydrogen ions make the environment more acidic. And so then the enzymes, like the mitochondrial function, everything doesn't like an acidic environment. It likes an optimal pH. And so then things get sluggish. And so if you can improve that removal, which they're doing that by improving blood supply, enzyme function, ATP production, muscle fiber numbers, muscle fiber thickness, then that's going to improve your conditioning response. What happens with the cardiovascular system?
So, as we were talking about before, you have a change in your heart size and function. So the stroke volume, the amount of blood that's being pumped out of the heart per heartbeat increases from 1 litre to 1.3, 1.4 with a horse that's gone from, their standard, how they are in the paddock, to when they're very fit. And their cardiac output increases. So like we were saying before, if you are pumping out on average 1 litre of blood per heartbeat, and then you take that over a minute, when you go for a full gallop, because your heart rate comes up to such a high rate, up to 240 beats per minute, simply because of that, you're simply just putting out so much more blood over a minute coming out of the heart back into the body. So that's a pretty big deal. You also have a change in bone strength. So bones are really important. I don't know that we really talk about them as much as we could, particularly when it comes to developing them later in life. When horses are young, there's often conversations about, conditioning the bone to hold up to particularly becoming a working horse, like when you start to ride a horse. So you can have too much loading in a young horse, and you can also have too little. So if you also think about the timelines for conditioning responses, you've got to consider that the body adapts to loading, but the timelines for different systems and tissues is different. So bone versus the muscle that we've just spoken about, the process of just, building fitness often happens faster, or in the short term, you can get quite fit in a few months, but other systems, particularly your bone and tendons, you want to make sure that you're loading them appropriately, over a much longer period. So if you have too much bone loading, you can have, obviously, worst case, like fractures and things like that traveling through the bone. But with too little, then you're also asking weak bones to absorb too much concussion, or, if you go for a good gallop with weak bones, you're at risk of an injury. So, there's a lot to consider there when,
Can I just jump in
also,
with bones?
pardon?
Let's jump in with bones. So bone remodeling is at its quickest in young horses, so they can respond much more quickly to a training episode, but they don't need much. So like 10 minutes of high intensity, 5 to 10 minutes of high intensity, can create a bone loading situation, such as on a hard surface, especially initially. So, that's why it's so good for young horses to have a good gallop every now and again. As horses age, their ability for bone to remodel slows right down. So you can still remodel bone, the bone can still change, but it's much slower. And it's a much more dense tissue at that point. And so, we talk about starting horses and different timing and things. With a young horse, we do want to appropriately load the bone to optimize the time of bone remodeling. And so, there have been studies to show training 2-year-old racehorses, apart from, there's a whole other aspect to this, but it can actually help in bone strength if they're trained appropriately at that age because of your high bone turnover at that time. However, like you said, if you overload them, then you get shin splints and microfractures, and it's actually setting up for degenerative processes occurring. It's degenerating the cartilage in the joints and you're reducing their longevity. And so we don't want to overload them by doing a whole stack of gallops. And so you've got to be really mindful about how we load those bones. And also the most important aspect of that is the recovery time. So it takes at least 72 hours for the bone to recover. So if you're doing a high intensity workout today and a high intensity workout 2 days later, the bone has not had a sufficient time to recover. It doesn't mean that they need full time off in that 72 hours, but you don't want to add a stress on top of stress bone. So you want to, do your high intensity, and they say like 3 to 4 times a week. You want to do that high intensity, but then you want to make sure that the next few days are a lower intensity and that they've got time to recover.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's everybody wants to protect their young horses' joints because they're an issue that comes up commonly, especially in performance and sport horses. So if you take your time in the beginning to make sure that your loading is appropriate and use your variable training systems, creating variation in your training so that you don't have to do the hardest things to build the system, you're going to be at an advantage.
Yeah, definitely. So if we're looking at, how long it takes for a horse to develop a conditioning response, one thing I just want to say there is tendons, apart from the first, I think, 12 months of life, tendons don't respond to training. So they've been studies done where the cross-sectional area of the tendon hasn't increased with training. And actually what we need to support is not the tendons, but the muscle development. And so the muscles that connect to the tendons will respond with training, but the tendons themselves, we're not training the tendons, we're not hardening up the tendons. If we're doing hard surface training, we're thinking about bone, and we're thinking about developing the muscles to support the tendons.
So could you just tell everybody what you mean by the cross-sectional size doesn't change for anybody who
Yeah,
might
so
not?
if you made a cross section across the cannon bone, like across the tendon, so you kind of cut the leg crossways, then you're looking at the thickness or the diameter of the tendon. And so with muscles, we know that when you train them, especially with strength training, you get bigger muscles. And then obviously with endurance and marathon training, the muscles themselves don't get bigger, but you've got a better capillarization, you've got an improved ability for that muscle to function. There's still more muscle fibers, better quality. They're just not big like your type 2, so you don't have that size difference. So the tendon size, I guess you would say, is not increasing, whereas that's what we're kind of looking at with a lot of strength training.
Yes, and you, just for anybody who is wondering as well, just as a reminder, you have ligaments and tendons and muscle. So in the horse, you've got the suspensory ligament, which is a really important apparatus going down behind the cannon bone, going under the fetlock and coming around to the front of the hoof where it attaches in. But you have, and then behind that you have tendons, so the deep and superficial digital flexor tendon. But the deep and superficial flexor tendons, once they go over, the back of the knee or the back of the hock, and then they attach onto the bone above, there's actually a muscular portion to those tendons. So when you're talking about training the muscle associated with the tendon, what we're saying is the muscle portion of that entire tendon muscle system that goes from, there's lots of tendons in the body because tendons go between muscle and bone, but the ones in the legs are extra special because they're a really long tendon with a muscular portion at the top, and then the tendon goes all the way down the leg to the foot. And commonly, everyone recognizes, oh, you don't have muscles below the knee and the hock. It's one of the challenges with injuries down there. So yeah, just thinking about the fact that, like you said, tendons don't condition beyond that first 12 months of life in terms of their cross-sectional size. So yeah, we're training the muscle associated with the tendon.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, the suspensory can be a little bit different because it does have the propensity to incorporate muscle fibers in its structure. So it can heal a bit differently, but also what I'd say is I've seen a lot of legs under dissection and a lot of legs that were probably considered sound, with nearly all of them having tendon degeneration. Like thickening in the tendon, splitting of the tendon fibers, increased vascularization, increased kind of hardness in them in a negative way. And so, I think in so many horses, those tendons are overloaded because of a reduced efficiency and strength of the muscles that are supporting them and the upper body support postural. That training hasn't necessarily been done appropriately to increase biomechanical efficiency. So, what else in terms of how quickly or, slowly it takes for the body to respond?
So we mentioned that, things happening on a physiological level. One thing is the enzymes inside the body, in the cells or, in the muscles. So those enzymes begin to change when long, slow distance is combined with moderate intensity 3 times a week. The body begins to respond within 10 to 14 days when you begin training. So it's really, it's quite a quick response, realistically. That's a development and a change. The horse's body is beginning to change. Muscle fibers take 6 to 12 weeks to alter in response to 3 times a week, including maximal heart rate intensive training. So that comes back to what you said in the beginning about going to the gym once a week isn't really going to get you to the stage where you're pumping out your push-ups, because we're saying here 6 to 12 weeks to alter. That's 1.5 to 3 months to alter in response to 3 times a week, including maximal heart rate. So you're really pushing it, intensive training. So I do actually remember being in nutrition. It was a nutrition class, but when you're reading the logos on the feed bags and it says that you would increase your food based on the work, we all did surveys about how much work we thought we were doing, and the reality was nearly everybody's horse was in like the low workload zone. Whereas, you think if you're just going out like a few times a week, you're actually in work. But we're just saying that, it takes longer than you think it does. And so 1.5 to 3 months, that means that you are not going to adequately condition your horse in 3 weeks to go out to an event, or, to say, oh, I've got such and such in a few weeks, I'm going to pull my horse out and get ready for the camp draft. It takes longer than you think it does. And in terms of your fitness, so once you get to a point, that's going to be different. We're talking about starting from a point. In terms of losing fitness, it starts at about 6 weeks, when you begin to really lose it. And when you have 3 or 4 months of reduced exercise and intensity, once you've got a much more significant change. So if you've got a horse that's got to the point of being fit, you want to save their joints, muscle attachments, and you want to work on maintaining their postural stability and core function, because once you've hit the point where you've conditioned your horse, you just have to keep them going and ticking along, as opposed to doing a lot of miles. So as Raquel was saying, you don't need to be doing, gosh, I remember doing your subject and trying to rationalize this at the time, doing assignments on, training plans. If you are working up to 100K endurance rate, you don't have to have been doing 100Ks, a week or 100Ks every few weeks, so that when you get to your comp, you're ready for 100. And learning more about even people, runners, they save their race for race day. They do, interval training and different kinds of training leading up. You have a small period of rest to make sure your body has all their stores ready, and then you go out and you do your race. So, once you have that fitness, you're not looking at taking 1.5 to 3 months to build your fitness. You want to keep it ticking along. And knowing that you've got a little bit of time there. So if you do have to step away, then you know how long you have before you're going to have a real decrease in your horse's strength and fitness.
Yeah, like we detrain really quickly. So, if we've been training and we stop for 2 weeks, we've lost a sufficient amount of fitness. Whereas with a horse, yeah, you can stop for like 6 weeks and not lose cardiovascular fitness. If your horse isn't appropriately posturally trained, you might lose postural stability, like good posture. And this is why it's so important to have that as a foundation, because if you have a horse who's conditioned cardiovascularly, as well as a horse who's conditioned, with efficient posture and motion, you have a horse that you can give a couple of weeks off easily. But if you're dealing with a horse, which often horses that I'm seeing, with already physical challenges, there's some horses that I've said to people, it's fine, you can stop doing your, maybe they're in the break for the season. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Like, stop doing your dressage training. You don't have a dressage comp now for a few months or whatever it is, eventing, whatever it is. But don't stop, with a horse that is a little bit biomechanically compromised. Because with them, you want to maintain their posture, maintain their core strength, because then when you bring them back into work, it'll be easy. So you might change what you're doing. Like I remember years ago, I had a rider and she was a dressage rider and her horses had been competing through the season and they both had physical challenges. And I was like, don't just give them now 3 months off. And I was like, and she did trail rides and she did in-hand work and she rehabbed any weaknesses that they had. And then when they came back, like it was such a quick reintroduction. And you only have to do that a couple of times a week, to maintain that, because they've got the cardiovascular fitness. They can have the 6 weeks off for that, but just to maintain any other physical kind of imbalances. But the longer period of time that a horse has off, then like if a horse has then had three, well, longer than 6 weeks, but especially, 3 months off, they are completely, to a point of being deconditioned. Like 3 to 6 months off, they're deconditioned. And so then you need to start from scratch. You don't have that baseline anymore. And if they haven't had, a consistent amount of time in work before they have time off, so obviously the longer they've been training for, the fitter they're going to be, and so they're going to maintain that training response for longer. But if you've only had your horse in work for 3 months, and so you've, built up a level of cardiovascular fitness, so that change, took a few weeks to really kick in. Like muscle fibers take 6 to 12 weeks to respond. So if you've only had your horse in training for 3 months and then you give them, 6 weeks off, you're not picking even 4 weeks off, even 3 weeks off, you're not at the same point anymore. Like as a horse that's done 12 months of consistent training, you've given them 6 weeks off, they've come back in, you can, pick up not where you left off, but you're going to get back to there way quicker. So yeah, it's really just considering those aspects. Like there's really so much to talk about with conditioning and training. And it's really easy to overdo it. The one thing I would kind of finish, with around that is that the best way to cardiovascularly condition your horse is through interval training. And so you do quicker intervals, shorter sessions, quicker intervals going up towards maximal heart rate and then giving a sufficient rest time, as opposed to doing, long gallop sessions or, longer sessions. Like do shorter, more intense sessions. That's how you're going to build cardiovascular strength. For your long, slow distance, it's your 40 to 60 minutes of easy work. So that's where we're starting off initially with bringing a horse back into work. We're not doing the interval training until, at least depending on what they're coming in at, but, might be somewhere around the 4 to 6 mark that you're starting to add the intervals, depending on your intervals, right? So just consider that. Interval training for cardiovascular fitness. You want good postural training to support appropriate conditioning and optimize your conditioning program. And you want to consider, how long your horse has actually been in training for, to give them time off and what your detraining effect is. Bone only takes 10 minutes of high intensity work 3 to 4 times a week. Initially, that might be on just trotting on a hard surface, but later on, it can be galloping on grass or an all-weather surface. So you don't need long periods of time to condition bone, and horses do not need to be trained to a sweating point 5 days a week. I've heard of trainers who literally train their horses hard every single day and they do not give them a time off, or they might just have one day off. Horses are such amazing athletes. They do not need to be trained to that intensity. We need to train smarter, not harder, to reduce injury risk and fatigue and allow the body time to recover.
Absolutely. And yeah, just to that point, reminding people that, like we said, you are not going to get fit in 3 weeks. So if you, every now and then you hear of people again who are like, oh, I'm just going to do a few days of hard work to set my horse up.
Yeah.
But you've really put yourself on the back foot because you aren't going to condition anything in that time. And possibly you're even going to further fatigue your horse, putting you both at risk. An unconditioned horse who's then fatigued before you even go out to work, you're really at a disadvantage. It's so important to have that, the fitness there as a foundation.
Yeah, and just like use something to monitor, like figure out what you can monitor in your horse for fitness. So decide how you're going to increase your training. So whether you're going to increase by time, by repetitions, or you're going to measure heart rate recovery, how you're going to monitor your horse's fatigue, what signs you're going to look for. There's some really good equipment out there for monitoring heart rate in horses if you need to cardiovascularly train your horse. And there's also other awesome equipment out there to monitor stride quality, such as the Equestic saddle clip. So you can use that to monitor improvements in stride quality, rhythm, I think it does straightness, suppleness, those sorts of things. So measure your progress and set yourself up with a basic training plan to appropriately condition your horse.
Absolutely. So what do you think our takeaways are from this episode? I know there's a bit going on. I hope that we were really clear for people. They can always send us an email and say, can you expand on something if there's something here that's also been really valuable or important. I don't see that these concepts are always spoken about. So we'd love to hear from anybody who has questions about this or anything else. What do you think our biggest takeaways were?
Train smarter, sorry, not harder. Train smarter, not harder. So, think about how you can be more efficient and effective in your training. and make sure that your horse has good biomechanics and good posture as a foundation for your conditioning. They're probably my two biggest takeaways. What about you?
It's not one or the other, training versus conditioning. You do need both. They go hand in hand, because posture and behavior go hand in hand, which is something you speak about really as being very important. So conditioning and willingness go hand in hand, because the ease with which your horse does something increases their willingness to do something. So it's hard to run when you're not fit. And that these things increase rider and horse safety, well-being, and welfare, because you're both worth taking care of and making sure that your risk of injury has decreased. And if anybody wants to think of more creative ways also to bring these different ways of training, our episode 16, creating variation in training, is useful as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. I hope that you kind of gained an insight into training and conditioning through this podcast. So thanks for joining myself, Dr. Raquel Butler, and Sophie Vandenberg. Enjoy your horse time. Please subscribe to the Equine Functional Posture podcast so you don't miss our weekly episodes, and give us a 5-star rating so we can share more valuable insights.
And we'll see you in the next exciting episode.